Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Leo Baeck Institute here at the Center of the Center for Jewish History. I have to say I'm very unhappy that we have to run so many programs on anti-Semitism recently, obviously, but I'm happy to see you all. I recognize a few people who have come back, who attended previous installments of this series. Today is the third program in a series in which we, the Leo Baeck Institute, offer historical perspectives on current debates, in this case on anti-Semitism and Jewish responses to anti-Semitism. As you may know, I think it is, okay, sorry. As you may know, the Leo Baeck Institute was founded 70 years ago. We are an archive in which we preserve German Jewish history and culture. We have millions of documents which speak to all kinds of aspects of German Jewish history, including anti-Semitism, for obvious reasons. We will start the program today with a little advertisement for LBI and our archive, as Renate Evers, our Director of Collections, will present a few documents from the archive that set the stage for the following discussion under the title Fighting Back Jewish Responses to Anti-Semitism. And we will then have a discussion between two experts on this topic, who I will introduce. Michael Brenner is a professor at American University in Washington, D.C. He has written 10 books, researched on many aspects of German Jewish history, with one focus being German Jewish history in the 1920s and the 1930s. Michael is also the president of LBI International, that is the umbrella organization under which LBI New York, Jerusalem, and London operate. And he will provide the historical context to the past events, which we think speak to the present and can inform the debate about the present anti-Semitism and Jewish responses. Michael's interlocutor is Jane Eisner. She was the longtime editor of The Forward, and in this role shaped one of the most important and influential voices in the contemporary American Jewish discourse, and continues doing so as an educator. So she's in the perfect position to help us find out how this German Jewish past is relevant to the American Jewish present and future. After that discussion, Jane and Michael will address questions or comments which you may have. You received note cards, and I invite you to write whatever you want to share with the audience and with the panelists on those note cards, which will be collected towards the end of the discussion. And the Q&A part will be followed by a reception outside in the auditorium. We plan to continue this program, the LBI Forum on Antisemitism and Democracy, with future events, so please keep your eyes open for those. For now, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank all our speakers, and I want to thank LBI trustee Charles Hesdorfer, who set up a fund in the name of his grandparents, the Heinz and Erna Meyer Fund, which allows us to bring programs as the one today to you. Welcome, everybody, and I invite Renate to set the stage for the discussion today.
Okay. Good morning. I will give you a brief visual introduction, into the historical context of the experience of German Jews in 1932, specifically examples of defense strategies against rising anti-Semitism, highlighting the role of the leading Jewish civil rights organization in Weimar Germany, the CV, or Zentralverein. So the full name of the organization was, bear with me, Zentralverein Deutscher Staatsbürger Jüdischen Glaubens, translated as Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith. They fought hard and long about that name. We will stick with the short version CV, CV or Zentralverein. Founded in Berlin in 1893, the CV aimed to protect Jewish civil and social equality. It became a key representative of German Jews, combating anti-Semitism through legal activities, such as the Legal Aid Office and legal aid in court trials, political lobbying extensively, educational initiatives for both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. The CV notably used broad media campaigns to enhance Jewish self-confidence on the one hand and to raise awareness among non-Jews. These media campaigns were initially more defensive. The CV used combative posters, such as this example from 1919, which you saw last week, if you were here. The Zentralverein also published brochures and resources such as Anti-Anti, a loose-leaf collection offering practical advice and facts on countering anti-Semitic attacks and tropes. A similar loose-leaf collection was created in 1930, Anti-Nazi. However, the impact of these initially more aggressive efforts was seen as potentially counterproductive. In the mid-1920s, the Zentralverein became more focused on educational work, as embodied by two flagship newspapers for its members. The CV Zeitung, that's the German version, a weekly with news and shorter articles, and Der Morgen, a bi-monthly with longer articles. Here is a photo of the editorial office of the CV Zeitung in Berlin in 1936, and here at a newsstand around the same time. Starting in 1926, a monthly edition of the CV Zeitung was introduced alongside the weekly version. So this is a whole media campaign at the time. It was aimed at engaging and informing a non-Jewish audience. By 1927, about 52,000 copies were distributed free of charge. March 32. Presidential elections were held in Weimar Germany with a runoff in April. Incumbent Paul von Hindenburg won a second term against Adolf Hitler, who had just obtained German citizenship and gained almost 37% of the vote. During this time, the Zentralverein published a brochure entitled We German Jews, 321 to 1932. The date 321 in the title referenced an edict of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, the first documented presence of Jews in the Roman Rhineland province in the 4th century. Alongside the 321 brochure, the monthly CV Zeitung published a special issue. And I would just like to give you a quick overview about the main arguments and how these two parallel publications presented them visually with great effort and care. So that's basically the discourse that they were doing. The CV Zeitung also argued that for more than 1600 years, Jews had lived on German soil and had been part of German language and culture, countering the anti-Semitic view that they were an alien presence in Germany. The patriotism of German Jews in World War I was highlighted and juxtaposed with ongoing cemetery desecrations. Similarly addressed by the CV Zeitung, German Jews in the fight for the German homeland. The brochure challenged the anti-Semitic stereotype of a Jewish race by featuring a map of a multitude of Germanic tribes with the sarcastic question, the German race? The cultural contributions of German Jews were the main focus of both publications. Here the brochure visualized examples such as Jews in government and legal professions, Jews in the natural sciences, Jews in sport, and even Jewish explorers, discussed in the CV Zeitung as pioneers of African and Asian studies. Both publications concluded with refuting anti-Semitic tropes, here debunking the myth of Jewish wealth, and the plea to fight anti-Semitic catchphrases and language, from ritual murder to Jewish Marxism. And this image is also no coincidence. I mean, you're cutting off the head of a dragon and the next head is growing back. Overall, the Zentralverein's various strategies against anti-Semitism had both successes and pitfalls. The arguments in the 1932 media campaign ultimately reached and convinced too few people. With that, I conclude the visual introduction of one organizational Jewish response and strategy to combat anti-Semitism in Weimar Germany. Now, I would like to turn it over to our panelists, Jane Eisner and Michael Brenner, who will discuss Jewish responses to anti-Semitism both then and now. and we are so looking forward to your exchange. So please come up to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Want to make sure everyone can hear me? Great. I'll try. Thank you so much for joining us here today, especially on Marathon Sunday. I know how hard it is to get around the city because I had trouble as well. But I think the conversation will make it worthwhile. You know, it's often said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I'm sure that you have all heard that phrase, supposedly uttered by Mark Twain, although actually there's no evidence that it indeed came from him. But the observation stands nonetheless. That is why I'm so eager for this conversation, to learn from a true expert about the Jewish communal responses to the rise of Nazi Germany and what that might teach us today. In essence, to see how history rhymes. So Michael, can we set the stage? We often assign the rise of Nazis to the 1930s, especially 1933. But in fact, it was foreshadowed in the 1920s. So take us back there. Explain what happened then.
Right, so thank you. Can you all hear me? Thank you, and it's always great being back at the center and the LBI. In the early 1920s, I would say Adolf Hitler launched kind of a test run for what would come later. Of course, you know, he wouldn't know that timing yet. Nobody could know the timing. But what I actually tried to cover in my last book, which covers Munich after World War I, is that the Nazi Party used Munich as a testing ground for how, you know, German voters, German public would react to themes like anti-Semitism and others. And in a way, Munich became the capital of this new kind of anti-Semitism in the early 1920s. It ended, the first run ended with the failed beer hall putsch, an attempted coup or insurrection, as we might say today.
Can you tell us more about that?
23. Sure. So already in June of 1923, the writer and later Nobel Prize winner Thomas Mann described Munich actually in an American publication in English as the city of Hitler. Hitler had no office. He had no official function whatsoever, but his presence and the presence of the Nazi Party and you know, and the associates were so strong in Munich that he described it as city of Hitler. And what happened, I don't want to go too much into detail, but there was a revolution in Munich, as everywhere in Germany, which overthrew the monarchy the end of 1918. The first prime minister of the new so-called Free State of Bavaria was a Jewish journalist from Berlin called Kurt Eisner, a moderate socialist.
I don't think a relation of mine, but...
That's right. Who knows? He was the first Jewish head of state ever in Germany, and kind of the last too. One can discuss that, but there wasn't much more to come. And he was assassinated after 3 months.
Can you just explain for a moment, what percentage of the population then was Jewish, and what role do they play in society?
Overall in Germany, about 1%, about 600,000 out of 60 million. I would say the role they played in society in many ways is a little comparable to American Jews, who are a little, you know, larger percentage, but not that much more. They were visible in the economic sector, definitely in the cultural sector. Not in politics, though, before World War I. Even though Jews had equal rights already since 1871, they were not appointed to high official positions like government ministers. There were few, but a few Jewish professors who had not converted before. Very few judges who happened to be Jewish, but no government ministers. So in that respect, Eisner, and a few years later, in 1922, in the German larger politics, Walter Rathenau, the first Jewish foreign minister, were firsts. And Rathenau had the same tragic end as Eisner and was assassinated a few months after he was appointed German foreign minister in 1922.
So here you had these two Jews who were in important leadership roles, and yet the population of Jews was minuscule.
That's right. But there
and
weren't that many political leaders either who were Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were exceptions.
So did that encourage the kind of antipathy towards them?
Well, so the exception was really Munich in 1918-19. After Eisner was assassinated, there were two short-lived socialist, and the second one was a communist council republics, or you might also say Soviet republics, although scholars today prefer council republics, but it's the same word as the Russian Soviet. And almost all of the leaders happened to be Jewish. That was 1919. The Jewish community of Munich, and I'm trying to show this in the book, the Jewish community of Munich was not happy about that. You know, they didn't say, oh, great, now we have a Jewish head of state, and we have all these Jewish politicians. They knew if that failed, they would be accused. And also they were not socialists, and certainly not communists. Most Munich and Bavarian Jews, rather center or even conservative. Some of them really were unhappy that the king was gone, and Bavaria wasn't a monarchy anymore. So they knew, as I think it was supposedly, as you said, you never know was the origin of all these quotes, but supposedly the chief rabbi of Moscow had said in 1917, the Trotskys make the revolutions and the Bronsteins pay the price for it. So Bronstein, of course, was Trotsky's name. And the Munich Jews knew, the Eisners, and the Tollers and the Mühsams and the Landauers make the revolution. And we, the Munich Jews, will pay the price if it failed. And it failed terribly. In May of 1919, the whole experiment was over, and what we see happening over the next few years is a reaction to it, a conservative. Bavaria becomes the most conservative state. Now, Hitler is not part of that. The Nazis are not part of it. But a very conservative government takes over. Very anti-foreign sentiments. And they even tried twice, in 1920 and 1923, to expel some East European Jews from Bavaria. It's a whole story why in the end that wasn't successful. And I'm jumping now to 1923 because we want to go further, right? In 1923, it is a very conservative government in power. That's the moment on November 8th of 1923 when Hitler and his comrades, and the main other leader was the famous World War I General Ludendorff, storm into a beer hall, because all important events in Munich happen in beer halls. Thousands of people, just the largest halls they had. And he comes in with his pistol and fires a few shots into the ceiling, and then he disappears with the then strong man, the governor of Bavaria. They come back and they declare like a new government, Bavaria, and they will launch a march on Berlin following Mussolini's role in March on Rome. And we don't know exactly what happened, if the governor of Munich was threatened by Hitler or if he did it voluntarily, but he certainly changed his mind during the night hours, and the Bavarian police and troops would not go along with Hitler and would not allow the coup, the insurrection, to happen. Hitler fled, was arrested, and one of the other problems was that the justice system, the judges, as people said at the time, were blind on their right eye. They gave very harsh verdicts against left-wing political leaders and terrorists, but not against right-wings. Hitler was celebrated as a hero, not only in the streets by many, but even within the courtroom by the judge, who gave a very mild punishment of, in the end, he was less than 1 year in prison, and the prison was not a real prison. I would call it a writer's retreat. If you see the pictures, he's visited by Rudolf Hess and all of his associates. He's writing his Mein Kampf during the few months in Landsberg when he is in, and then he's already let free in December of 1924. The Nazi Party by then is a small party in German-wide, and it takes until 1930 that they have their first major success, where they got about 18%. And then in 1932, we saw the presidential election results, but there are also parliamentary elections. And by the end of 1932, they receive about 37% of the votes in Germany, which was the largest they ever got in kind of free elections.
So set the stage for us. It's 1932. What was happening in Germany at the time that made the conditions possible for Hitler's further ascent?
So there were, of course, things happening on different levels. Politically, after World War I, many Germans felt humiliated, not just because they lost the war, but they were punished for having started the war, which of course Germany denied, and they had to pay reparations. They had to give away certain territories which they had acquired before, to Poland, to France, and the economy did really not well, to use an understatement. In 1923, there was hyperinflation. When we talk about inflation today, people would be very happy to have that. When a loaf of bread in 1923 at some point cost a few billion marks, and you had to think, should I buy it when I get my paycheck, because if I wait till the evening, I don't have the money to buy a loaf of bread anymore. That all improved in the mid-1920s, but of course after the 1929 crash, German economy also suffered terribly. The unemployment rate was extremely high. And these were the conditions that always give rise to extremist movements.
But you have written that by 1932, conditions were starting to change. And you describe in some of your work a New Year's Eve that is surprisingly hopeful. The economic crisis seems to be abating. There's a kind of optimism politically. What happened then?
So there were two elections in 1932, and the Nazi Party actually lost some votes. They were still the strongest party, but they had, for the first time, they lost votes from 37 to about 33% of the votes. And that was seen as the beginning of the decline of the Nazi movement. And you can hear, actually, the TV-Zeitung, the newspaper, Renate, you presented to us, had some very, I thought, I look at what do the Jewish newspapers, what do they write about the new year? On usually around December 31st, the newspapers try to predict what's happening next year. And it was, there was some concern, but overall it was optimistic. In 1930, some people even had a line which 1933 will be a good year for us German Jews. And many intellectuals went along with this. To give you an example, the writer Leon Feuchtwanger, one of the most prominent German Jewish writers, he happened to be on a tour in America in December of 32 and January of 33. And he basically, his message was, Hitler is over. That was his message. He met with Albert Einstein, who was at the time in California, in January of 32. He was received by Eleanor Roosevelt here in New York. And his message was, Hitler is over, he's declining, the movement is declining. Actually, on January 30th, where was he then? He was here in New York. He had a reception given for his honor at the German consulate in New York City, the day Hitler was appointed chancellor. And he received a telegram from his wife, Martha, who had stayed back in Berlin. And she said to him, Leon, you made a fool of yourself, predicting Hitler is over. And Feuchtwanger was one of many who thought early in January 33 that there is a turn and the Nazi Party is losing. It was still the strongest party, but they seem to have lost some of their momentum for some observers.
But it wasn't just Jews who were so hopeful. I read from you that the leading Berlin newspaper wrote that the downfall of Hitlerism, not just Hitler, right, but Hitlerism, was, quote, unstoppable.
Right.
So how did they get it so wrong?
Yeah, and the newspaper, of course, was owned by a Jewish family, and many of the writers were Jewish, but it wasn't a Jewish newspaper How did they get it so wrong? Well, don't we all sometimes get it so wrong? I mean, I always think it's so hard to predict what is going to happen, and historians are often asked, and we, of course, just are not always, usually are not the best to ask. They really saw some of the signs. As you said, the economy seemed to recover slowly. Politically, the Nazi Party seemed to have lost at least a little bit, and you grasp every bit of hope you have, because people want to look with optimism into the future, not with pessimism. And I think that even very, very smart political observers, writers, intellectuals had this hope on December 31st and even the first days of January of 1933.
And wasn't it also because there were kind of parallel things happening to give you hope? Tell us about this. There was a Jewish museum that opened at that time. Jewish museum.
The first Jewish museum in Berlin, in its own building, opened on January 24th, 1933. And it was reported in the news everywhere. There was a German official government delegation praising the art of the Jewish museum. January 24th, 1933. I even found one quite interesting article by a Jewish art critic who described the artwork, and there was one ancient vessel from the Roman times from Palestine they displayed, and it had a swastika and a Star of David on it. And he said kind of, oh, isn't that cute, or something like that. Of course, neither was the Star of David a Jewish symbol then, nor was the swastika, of course, a symbol for what it became later. But what an irony that was. So even later, there was a German government delegation touring the museum. That was January 24th, and I think, 6 days later,
yes,
everything changed.
So on January 30th, how did it happen that Hitler becomes chancellor?
So there were, and I won't go into the details of German politics in these days because it is very complicated, but there were intrigues of different conservative German leaders. They were not Nazis, but they all were arranging intrigues against each other because they wanted to be in power. One of them was Franz von Papen, a conservative leader, and I should say an important part had also German industrial leaders who wanted a strong man. And they all naively thought they would be able to control Hitler once he is appointed. The process, so there was no election in January of 1933, but the president, who had kind of more of a ceremonial role in Germany until today, the president of Germany was the then quite old, in his mid-80s, World War I General von Hindenburg. And Paul von Hindenburg, to many accounts, was no longer quite, able to do his business, but he was under the influence of his son, who was actually a fan of Hitler, and the very right-wing and industrialists, and some of the conservative leaders who thought they can use Hitler for their own purposes. And they all looked down on Hitler. You know, many of them came from aristocratic families, many of them came from industry, were industrial leaders, and they thought, you know, he's still the largest party, we'll use him, and we can control him. And they helped him, or helped Hindenburg, to appoint him on January 30th as it seemed, first of all, one of the many chancellors that were appointed in these 13, 14 years of the Weimar Republic. But they were wrong. Hitler was much smarter than all of them, certainly Franz von Papen. The first Hitler government only had very few Nazi ministers in it. Most of them were non-Nazis, but very soon they all had to leave. Von Papen, who thought who could be the strong man, he was a Catholic, he was a member of the Catholic Center Party, very much on their right wing. Very soon he would be delegated to totally meaningless positions, but put him as an ambassador to the Vatican and to Turkey. And within a few weeks, Hitler and the Nazi Party succeeded in, first of all, with democratic means, to basically dissolve the democratic system of the Weimar Republic.
And then about 4 weeks later comes the fire, the Reichstag fire. The parliament building is set afire and burns to the ground. I've always been curious about that. Who's responsible? What was the motivation? What was the consequence of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And historians still struggle to have a definite answer. Mm-hmm. But of course, many thought, and some think, that it was actually arranged by the Nazis to put the blame on the communists and to outlaw the Communist Party and to basically arrange raids against the left wing, especially the Communist Party, which was then also a very strong party. Whoever was responsible for it, the Reichstag fire meant basically Hitler was now in power, the end of February now of 1933, can use emergency laws to set and use also for the coming elections, which took place on March 5th of 1933. These were already elections that were no longer entirely democratic elections, and still the Nazi Party didn't get an absolute majority. They still had under 50%. But by now, these were really the last even partially free elections of Germany. Yeah.
Michael, was there a significance to the fire being in the Parliament building?
Sure. I mean, the Parliament building still symbolized the Republic and the democracy, which Hitler and his allies always, spoke against and spoke low of and spoke down. But they used them. They used these means. But the parliament was not, they didn't go and rebuild the parliament. They didn't really, need it because Germany ceased to be a parliamentary democracy or democracy in general.
So it wasn't just that the fire burned down a building, it also symbolically eradicated parliamentary democracy there.
And to make it worse, they could blame the other side for it.
Yes, So what happens next?
So what happened next to Germany or to the Jews?
Well, I want to get to the Jews in a
Okay.
moment, but just overall, I'm just interested briefly in the broader context, so then we can understand
Right.
the Jewish reaction within that.
So very fast, Hitler assures the support of one other right wing, but not Nazi party. They have a majority, and he makes sure that even other parties give him power, which basically sets aside the basic values of that happens when you don't have, a real when you're not guarding democracy. As I said, the judicial system throughout most of the Weimar Republic was dominated by many judges who were not supporters of the republic and the democracy. They might not have been supporters of Hitler, but they wanted maybe a return to monarchy, a strong man, not that system. The same is true for many of the parties by now, by March 1933, who are more centered. There aren't many real center party left. The only party that really votes, the members of the only party now left in the Reichstag, in the parliament, that voted against Hitler's law to basically set aside the values of democracy, the only party against it were the Social Democrats. And they soon enough, of course, were also outlawed. And after this law, there are many other laws, especially also now on the basis of racial laws, where Jews are excluded from certain offices and professions. It seems almost unstoppable, and nobody seems to be willing to stop it. I mean, you can think who was willing to stop it at the time. Maybe the churches, who had some influence. In the very beginning, maybe the unions could have still done it, but within a few months, the opposition was not only had vanished, but it was clear if you would openly oppose this regime, there were new places where they sent you, like Dachau and other concentration camps. Dachau was not planned secretly and open secretly. It was opened already in March of 1933, right away. It was in all the major newspapers. And people would say, oh, if we say something about Hitler, you come to Dachau. So it was not only not secret, the Nazis wanted it to be known. Now, these were not the later, annihilation death camps. These were not camps where most of the inmates in 1933 and even in the years to follow would be Jewish. Well, some happened to be Jewish, but they were political opponents, and whoever the Nazi Party regarded as their opponents.
So you have written that the Jewish responses to this phenomenon were not uniform, and that's a really important part of this whole series, really. And so I'd like you to take us through the different categories of Jews and how they differently responded.
Yeah, I think that's very important. If you study the sources, and you can just take the different newspapers, there were so many Jewish newspapers. By the way, none of them were outlawed in 1933. The Nazi policy in 1933 was that Jews, they should be encouraged to leave Germany, but those who stayed could stay as a kind of second-class citizen. And, for example, they created the Kulturbund, a cultural league, where Jewish artists who no longer could perform in German theaters and concert halls could now perform to a purely, exclusively Jewish audience. Jewish newspapers remained until 1938. Rabbinical seminaries remained there. And if you look at the Jewish newspapers, it's you know, I'm generalizing a little bit, but what are the reactions? So the mainstream, like the TV-Zeitung, the mainstream organization, we just heard about the defense organization called the Zentralverein. Well, they had actually almost the hardest position, because they felt themselves very strongly to be German first, German citizens of the Jewish faith. And if their whole ideology was destroyed overnight, one of the people who maybe represents this kind of mainstream liberal German Judaism, the painter Max Liebermann, who was, by the way, the honorary chairman of the Jewish Museum, opened in 1933. He wrote a letter in 1933 to the mayor of Tel Aviv, Mayor Dizengoff, and the famous Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik, and he said, "The abrogation of our rights weighs heavily about all of us German Jews, but especially on us more assimilated Jews who thought we could be both Germans and Jews." So that, I think, puts it really together. Then you had a group, the Zionists. They were not the majority, but they were there. And the German Zionists were also very, they were German, but they all the time had emphasized there is anti-Semitism, we're not maybe so safe here. And I wouldn't say they said, "I told you so," but a little bit. They said, "Look, you never wanted to hear, but our future should maybe be in a future Jewish state and not here." The Orthodox had the traditional response. It's God's punishment for our sins. They usually blamed the non-Orthodox Jews. And they said, there's nothing we can do but repent. And if once we fulfill all the mitzvahs, Hitler will be gone. And finally, there was a small splinter group, and it shouldn't be, exaggerated, but it existed, of very right-wing national German Jews. One of their leaders was a young intellectual called Hans-Joachim Schöps, who founded a right-wing youth movement. And he emphasized, we have nothing in common with these East European Jews. We have to set ourselves apart. We are just German Jews. And he wrote letters to the new German government, and we actually think it is necessary that Germany needs all of these, new politics and the new Germany against the humiliation after World War I. Of course, nobody, Hitler wouldn't, or anyone in these circles would read what he had to say, and he himself had to leave Germany in 1938. That was a small group, but they looked for some kind of arrangement with Nazi leadership.
Was this discrepancy, were these differences among the Jews in Germany at that time, were they evident to the larger German population? Or were Jews just sort of thought to be uniformly one way?
Well, that's a good question, and I can only guess. I don't think there were any polls or studies, but I think I wouldn't even say many Germans did not really have a clear picture of what Jews thought, or what Jews were, or how they lived. Those who, and by the time it was over a third of Germans who voted for the Nazi parties, that probably believed all the lies and myths spread about Jews. And the others, it also depended where they lived. Some, of course, there were social contacts and friendships, and some knew more. But of course, they would probably have less contacts with the Orthodox community than with the others, or even with the Zionists, maybe not as much as with the others. So I don't think that the majority of Germans were that well aware I don't know if the majority of American non-Jews today are aware of all the differences within American Jews.
Yeah, it just strikes me that I suppose it's easier to hate a group if you think just one way about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you have written that historians have often depicted German Jews as blind to what was happening around them. And you disagree with that, so tell us why.
Yeah, I think German Jews, and we even heard that very clearly in the few-minute presentation before, they founded the first defense organization against anti-Semitism in 1893. And they were very active in the 1920s fighting anti-Semitism. You know, both the more assimilated liberal and the Zionists. And they fought them in court, they fought them with, you know, lectures and all kind of literature. I think it's very hard to fight against something which in its core is an irrational argument, that anti-Semitism is, with rational arguments. And you almost, I mean, we just, you know, see it today. You're almost certain to fail, and we still do it because there's no other way, maybe, to fight it. And maybe it would be worse otherwise. But it's frustrating. And I think a lot of German Jews, and there were also non-Jews in Germany who fought anti-Semitism, were able to see that.
So let's go back to our historical timeline. By March of 1933, it became ever more difficult to oppose the regime. And we've already learned of one way that Jews were trying to resist. Were there other ways?
There were ways, but by March or April 33, I think the vast majority of German Jews were still thinking they could resist with legal means. You know, no, I think the majority did not believe Hitler was there to stay. I mean, many thought this even years later, but by spring of 33, the big hope, as you can see again in the newspapers, is the old president Hindenburg. He, as long as he's here, he will not let Hitler let us, you know, maybe they'll make us a little bit second-class citizens, but they won't do harm to us. Well, Hindenburg died in 1934, and then Hitler really became the Führer, right? There was nobody else. But even before that, I think Hindenburg didn't do much. You know, he made sure that some Jews were exempted from some laws, like those who had fought in World War I or were decorated. They could keep their jobs in certain areas, things like that. But then by 1935, you had the Nuremberg laws, and the second-class citizen was really clear. And you still have German Jews, actually, like the Zionist leader in Berlin, one of the Zionist leaders in Berlin, Georg Kareski, gave an interview. He said, okay, now, thank God we have the Nuremberg laws. It's clear. Now we know what it's about. We're second-class citizens, and second-class citizens, we are accepted if we, you know, are. But they won't harm us physically, even after the Nuremberg laws. It really, I would say, took till, not everybody thought that, but people and people in high up positions saw that. He used to be the head of the Berlin Jewish community. And it took really till the end of it. I would say Kristallnacht, it was clear, but even 1938 before that, with all these other laws where Jews were really driven out of economy totally, it became clear there's no other way. Otherwise, I think more German Jews would have tried to emigrate when it was much easier in 33 and 34 and 35. So you had about 30 to 40,000 Jews per year who emigrated out of 600,000. You may say that's a lot, but you may also say maybe it's not that much. Depends on how we view it.
So in just a few minutes, we're going to collect the cards that you've been given, and please note your questions. Some people don't think they have cards. Okay, glad I asked. We'll get those to you as soon as we can. Please craft these as questions, not statements. Questions generally end with a question mark, so please try to keep that in mind. So I'm wondering, Michael, at this time, mid-1930s, were Jews, especially surrounding Germany, outside of Germany, were they aware of what was going on? Were they concerned about it? And was there ways in which they were aiding the resistance?
Jews outside of Germany.
Correct.
Definitely. It depends, again, where. In America, there were rallies against the Nazi anti-Jewish laws, mainly, by the Jewish community. Of course, that was then taken as a pretext by Hitler and by the Nazis to issue more punishments against Jews, because supposedly the German Jews had stirred all that anti-German sentiment. But don't forget that there were many other states, it wasn't just Germany, in the mid-1930s that had anti-Jewish laws, especially in Eastern Central Europe, Poland, Hungary. Like, you had benches in the universities where Jewish students were forced to sit in the last rows and things like that.
And this was happening before those countries were invaded?
Yes, definitely.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's so
yeah.
interesting.
So there were anti-Jewish policies not only in Germany. An interesting case is Italy, because Italy, of course, had was the first fascist country, and Mussolini came to power in the early 20s. But the Italian fascism was not originally anti-Semitic. That really happened under German influence in 1938, and there were Jews who were members of the fascist party. So that was different. And there were actually quite a few German Jews who found refuge in Italy in the early thought they would be safe there.
So this wasn't just a German phenomenon?
It was not. There was something different, though. I think the centrality of anti-Semitism in the ideology of the governing party, that I would say was different. It was such a central element. And that also distinguishes anti-Semitism in Germany from, I would say, the other groups the German went against. The Jew was the main, image of your enemy, of the average, of what they call the German Volksgemeinschaft, of this new German community. And by the way, Hitler promised a lot of things, that the economy would become better, that Germany would be strong again, make Germany great again, and all that. And he did it to a certain extent. The economy improved. Maybe it would have improved anyway. He, against all the prohibition, armament was going, and the German, the Reichswehr was enlarged. But he did it at the expense of the others who were excluded and persecuted and murdered. But that core of his, Volksgemeinschaft profited. And they also profited, of course, so many Jews lost their jobs already in 1933. Many socialists and communists lost their jobs too. Somebody got all those jobs. So, yes, they did, these people, and that's probably the majority of the German people, might have done better.
So you wrote something, and I'd like to just briefly quote it. In many ways, it seems that Jews felt just as at home, as safe, and as integrated in Germany in the early decades of the 20th century as they feel in the United States 100 years later. Have the events of the last few years, and especially the insurrection on January 6, 2021, have that made you feel differently about this historical equation?
So when I wrote about this book about the German, 1923 and the insurrection, I didn't think of much of America, but then I wrote it in German first, and then the English edition came out, and in 2021, I just had to write a new introduction right after January 6th, and I thought, ooh, wow, there is, with all the different circumstances, and I really, as you said in the beginning, history might rhyme, but it doesn't repeat itself, and it's different, and the circumstances are different. But I thought, a lot of things are not so different. One of them is simply the question, when do we actually know it's too late? And what does it even mean too late? What do you do then? Did German Jews, did they have to know with the rise of anti-Semitism in the streets in 1932 that they should leave? Should they have left on January 30th or 31st night or made the decision to leave? It's hard to leave when your family's been there for generations. You have your business, your job. You may not have a different language than German. People usually don't leave out of fun because they have to, they leave. So I would say that's a question that I always ask myself now when you read every year now, anti-Semitism has new records and it's skyrocketing. And, it's not safe to be a Jewish student on campus and all of that. So what's next, right? And I think, German Jews in 1933, different conditions. We don't have an anti-Semitic government here. That's a big difference. But still, when and how I think it's hard to blame them for something we know today. But even in 1937, I think hardly anybody could have imagined the Holocaust, a systematic, if you'd ask people 1937, yes, maybe they come after us, maybe they will kill some of us, but a plan to kill all Jews worldwide or European-wide, I think that was beyond the imagination of most Jews and non-Jews too.
So since the theme of today is the response that Jews tried to make against the rise of Nazism, one of the questions was, were there any other general civil rights organizations in Germany, in addition to the CB, that either were Jewish and were trying to fight the regime or included Jews in their resistance?
That's a good question. And, the whole idea of civil rights movement, I don't even think existed in that way in Germany. Jews also were in that sense, the only minority. There weren't other comparable minorities. Germany, in that respect, people were white, people were Christian, they might have been Protestant and Catholic. Sure, there were Protestant Catholic minorities in certain territories, but that's different. And another important organization that was founded, also late in the 19th century, was a non-Jewish organization to ensure equal rights for Jews, or actually it was called Against Anti-Semitism. It's an interesting organization where many liberals, important historian, Theodor Mommsen was a member and others. But pretty early on, many Jews had also their problems with the organization because they thought Jews should basically give up their separate identity altogether. They should just become German and ideally, and many said that explicitly, ideally convert to Christianity. And then they'll be safe. And then I remember one of the headlines in a Jewish paper where an important Jewish historian said, "God save us from our friends." So that organization was protecting Jews, but didn't really want to keep them as Jews. The other organizations I can really think of are more associated with political parties in the center to the left. But I don't think, and others might have a different opinion, that there was a real civil rights movement in Weimar Germany, and not even in post-war Germany for that matter.
So another question just builds on that, which is, were there any techniques, any responses that were even mildly successful?
I think if you had asked in the late 1920s, the leaders of the organization Traunfein, they would have said, "Oh, we have a lot of successes. You know, the courts often, you know, gave us they punished some of the they forbade, they outlawed some of the anti-Semitic writings." The anti-Semites always had an argument. They would say, you know, the courts are just feuded, they're Judaized, you know. There's the Jewish lobby, the Jewish influence. They always had a reason why they would make this, you know, it wouldn't impress them. So the Jewish organization did have successes in court. Yes, some of their booklets and the newspapers were read. But I mean, as looking back from what we know now, we know they weren't super effective. Also, don't forget, they didn't fight to give Jews, I mean, before 1933, they didn't fight to give Jews equal rights. Jews had equal rights since 1871. They wanted just that these rights would be really implemented in everyday life.
One of the questions is asking about the influence of Americans Americans who were supporting Hitler. Joseph Kennedy, Lindbergh. Was this outside influence helpful for Hitler's consolidation of power? And were Jews, I'm adding something, were Jews in, say, America aware of that?
I think some Jews were definitely aware of that, some Jewish leaders. Was it helpful for Hitler? Yes. I mean, every, outside help is I don't think it was crucial. I don't think he needed that, but it was helpful, and he could always refer to that. Especially, of course, much more from European countries, including Britain, where you had a pro-Nazi movement as well. That was helpful. Did he need it? Probably not.
I'm just sort of wondering, looking back, could that have been another pressure point, another form of resistance?
It's hard, I think, especially back then when the global structure wasn't as tight as it is today, to topple him just by outside influence. I think it needed to come from inside. Again, I think the churches really failed, both Catholic and Protestant. The labor unions and the division within the left between socialists and communists who would not even talk to each other, right? Who saw themselves as the greatest enemies. And the center parties had diminished. So you had the left versus the right. And the communists also hated the republic and democracy. So the social democrats didn't want to go along with them. So it was that internal, internal infighting of the enemies, and the fact that many of the crucial positions in Weimar Germany had not been replaced from Imperial Germany, from the previous non-democratic regime, and they were just waiting for the republic to go away.
So I'd like to return to the sort of broader question about anti-Semitism, and a number of the questions picked up on your term of it being irrational. And I'm just wondering if you think that there were conditions, a culture in Germany that made it especially conducive to embracing this irrationality. And the question then will be, how about America now?
Yeah, I mean, the question, the first part, is really interesting because I think a lot of historians say if you had, a poll in, let's say, 1900, 1910, maybe even later, where do you expect, which European country do you expect to have the worst anti-Semitic government and policies? And probably not too many people would have picked Germany. Eastern Europe, definitely Poland, Russia, Romania, even France after the Dreyfus affair. Remember, in World War I, Germany was the protector of the Jews. The German army was often was welcomed with open arms by East European Jews to protect them and to liberate them from the anti-Semitic Tsarist regime. And for many East European Jews, that actually remained an image in 1939, but that's a different issue. So Germany was not, I'll give you an example now, that's totally anecdotal. It's my parents. My mother grew up in Germany, my father in Poland. My father said, anti-Semitism? I was always there in Poland. On Good Friday, we wouldn't dare to go out in the streets because the kids would throw stones on us after the priest had made an anti-Semitic. We didn't even think of anyone entering, Jews entering governing positions, and they were much larger. But anti-Semitism, my mother, and again, it's anecdotal but also typical, who grew up in Germany, said, she was like 10 or 9 when Hitler came to power, said, before that, I had no recollection of anti-Semitism. For me, it changed overnight. And so I don't think the explanation for this irrationalism is that anti-Semitism was larger in Germany than anywhere else. It had to do with other things which actually are very much rational. The actual implementation, which functioned so much better in Germany than in Poland or Italy or anywhere else, following orders, all of those things, which then actually would lead ultimately to the Holocaust, which I would argue was committed in the sense of not planned, but committed by many people who not necessarily were anti-Semites, but they followed these orders. They didn't think twice, and even when it came to kill people, they wouldn't think twice. So there is a different question that why Germany, in my view, than just anti-Semitism.
But I wonder, in Polish history, over many, many centuries, you see times when Jews were safe and embraced, and then times when they were not, and then back again and back again. I had the opportunity to go to the museum in Warsaw, and it's really interesting to see the entire history and see this back and forth. Was German history also subject to those trends? Because it just makes me wonder, was there something innate in the culture, even if it wasn't apparent in, say, 1900, that made ordinary people receptive to this?
I am very skeptical about these things innate in the culture, but I think there were many factors in German history that led to the fact that, a large part of Germans wouldn't, at least like Italians actually did, but Germans didn't stand up and defend their Jews. One of the problems, I think, is the long discussion over the emancipation. Like in France, there was discussion, 1789, 1790, 1791, then it was kind of over, and French Jews, and Napoleon did revise it, but then French Jews were just, equal citizens. In Germany, it was a process over 100 years. Yes, they should be, but before they become citizens, they have to prove that they deserve it. They have to integrate, they have to assimilate, and everybody understood something different. And it took almost 100 years until 1871 that finally Jews were equal citizens in all of Germany. And I think this discussion and this, as you say, up and down and back and forth, that really led to the fact that German many Germans weren't so sure if Jews were really deserving that equal rights thing.
Well, we are going to have to conclude in a few minutes, so I'm just wondering, from your historical perspective, is there a cautionary tale for us now? I mean, is there something rhyming in our history?
Right. Are we January 28th today? 2 more days. Look, I mean, I would not have thought that we have discussions like this in America when I came here first, which is a while ago, and then I went back and came back. And even a few years ago, I think most of us wouldn't have thought that we talk about anti-Semitism in America, and by the way, on the right and the left, in ways we talk about it today. But what worries me most when we talk about these issues is that there are so open attacks on democracy and the principle of democracy, and the total disregard for any kind of civil discourse, that in my view, the rhyme, even almost a deaf person should hear the rhyme. So it's there, and it's not only here in America. You have it in many other places too, I should say, but especially here, that democracy would be threatened in this country, and I think it's, in the end, it's never good for any Jewish community if democracy is threatened. And I mean, that's what I see. Others might see it differently, but I see we have to really look, even if the conditions were different, it was really different, but there are things that rhyme very much. And I'm saying this at a very crucial moment in American politics.
Well, thank you. I hope on that note we can focus on the resistance and not just on some of the dismaying possibilities. Thank you so much, Michael. This has been a really illuminating conversation. Thank you all for being such a good audience.
Thank you, Jen.